My parents abandoned me as a child due to my epilepsy, but now they're begging for my inheritance to help my drug-addicted brother. Through the fact that I was diagnosed with epilepsy. In my childhood, my parents abandoned me, but when I grew up, they asked me for money. At the age of 7, I was diagnosed with seizures, which was a significant challenge for my family. Emotionally and mentally unprepared to handle my condition, they began treating me like an outcast. I first noticed this around age 5, when I saw how differently they treated my older sibling, who was 2 years my senior. He received far better treatment, likely because he was easier to manage than I was. As if the seizures weren't enough, I was also diagnosed with reading difficulties and severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at the age of 9. My family was overwhelmed by my needs, but instead of rising to the challenge, they treated me like a burden. They had chosen to have children and should have been prepared for the responsibilities that come with it. My sibling turned out perfectly healthy, and they seemed to expect the same from me without considering the possibility of any complications. Their resentment was evident, and they made sure I felt like an unwanted burden. They would avoid engaging with me, and any room I entered would fall silent, the life seemingly sucked out of it just because of my presence. This behavior started when I was under 8 years old and worsened as I grew older, affecting my mental health deeply. In my teenage years, the emotional neglect led me to rebel. My anger and frustration manifested in defiant and disobedient behavior. I stopped putting effort into my studies, intentionally failing classes to express my dissatisfaction. My behavior became rude, pushing away even my friends. I knew it wasn't the right approach, but I was desperate for my parents' attention. Despite my efforts, my parents remained indifferent. Whenever the school called them in due to my misconduct, they would merely sigh in disappointment without bothering to reprimand me. It was frustrating, and I hated living with them. My temper tantrums at home were ignored, and they would openly discuss my behavior as if I wasn't there, dismissing it as me having another fit and rolling their eyes at my attempts to be heard. When I was 14, I reached a breaking point and violated a major rule at school. I brought a pack of cigarettes and started smoking right in the middle of class. When my teacher ordered me to stop and leave, I responded by giving him the finger. That was the final straw for me. I had always been a troublemaker, but my parents usually excused my behavior by claiming I wasn't a normal kid and that I had issues. This time, there was no excuse. I was expelled, and my parents were livid. They really let me have it that day, saying things I will never forget or forgive. It wasn't that I didn't already know how they felt, but hearing them say it out loud was devastating. They said they regretted ever having me, and that if they had known I would turn out like this, they would have terminated the pregnancy. They called me a burden and said they were better off with just one son. They decided that I would leave the family for good. I was grounded for a week, during which they literally locked me in my room. I was only allowed out for bathroom breaks, and my meals were brought to me. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or talk to anyone. I felt like a prisoner in solitary confinement, but it was worse because my own parents were doing this to me. I hadn't committed a crime. I had just been acting out, likely due to their neglect. They never gave me the attention I needed, and they should have been better parents. Yes, I wasn't easy to deal with because of my conditions, but they should have considered this before deciding to have a child. After that week, they showed me what they meant by saying I wouldn't be part of the family anymore. One day, out of the blue, they told me to get into the car with all my belongings. My brother and mom packed my things while I waited. About an hour later, we were driving on a familiar route. It soon became clear we were heading to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom. I thought they might let me stay there for a few weeks to straighten out, as my grandmother was strict but kind to me. However, once we arrived, I realized this wasn't temporary. They were abandoning me at my grandmother's house, essentially giving up on me. They had spent that week convincing her to take me in. When we got there, they unloaded my belongings at the door and told me to take them inside. They informed me that this would be my new home and said they didn't want any further contact with me. After what I had done, my parents told me they never wanted to see me again. They accused me of trying to ruin their reputation and claimed I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Standing at the door, I begged them not to abandon me because, despite everything, I still longed for a relationship with them. I was desperate for a sense of belonging in my family, making it incredibly difficult to accept that they were leaving me at my grandmother's house. I was also worried that my grandmother, who was in her 70s, might not be able to take care of me. It had taken her a week to agree to this arrangement because of her age. I knew she loved me, but I feared becoming a burden to her, just as I had been to my parents. Even though she had always encouraged me during my visits and expressed faith that my parents would come around if I behaved better, I was terrified that she might eventually resent me too. Despite my pleas, my parents were resolute. In front of me, they told my grandmother that they were done with me and didn't want to hear about me anymore. They said they couldn't have a freak like me living with them and needed to focus on my normal brother. Hearing them use the same language as the bullies at school was devastating. It made me realize that my parents were the biggest bullies in my life. Their words hurt more than anything the kids at school had ever said. At that moment, I stopped begging. I accepted that I was now going to live with my grandmother. I resolved to improve myself because both she and I deserved better. I decided not to throw my life away just because my parents didn't love me. Once my parents left, my grandmother and I had a much-needed conversation. She was honest and told me that although she loved me, she hadn't been ready to take me in. She had numerous concerns about my behavior, which she had heard about from my father. At her age, she doubted her ability to handle a troubled kid like me. She understood that I needed help, but wasn't sure she could provide the right environment for me to grow up in. This uncertainty was why it had taken her a week to make the decision. She explained that my father's account of grounding me and keeping me locked in my room for a week had made her reconsider. She realized that leaving me with them would do more harm than good, and despite her reservations, she chose to take me in. While thinking about what to do, my grandmother concluded that her son was not the right kind of parent to raise me. She apologized for not intervening earlier, since she also had to consider her own situation. Being a widow with limited resources, she was unsure if taking me in was the right thing to do. But now that she understood how badly I had been treated, she saw why I'd acted out and wanted to give me a fresh start. Unlike my parents, she encouraged me to view this as an opportunity, and that's exactly what I did. I apologized to her for my past behavior and forgave her for not stepping in sooner. We decided to leave the past behind and work together for a better future. From that day forward, I dedicated myself to turning my life around with her support. I am deeply grateful to my grandmother for everything she did for me. Without her, I wouldn't be the person I am today. After moving in with her, I made a conscious effort to improve in all areas of my life. She supported me, providing the environment I needed to excel. She found the right tutors to help me with my academics and enrolled me in a private school, ensuring that everyone there understood my unique needs. Unlike my parents, she didn't use my conditions as an excuse, but as a reason to provide me with the necessary help. This support allowed me to graduate with good grades and attend college like any other student. For that, I owe everything to my grandmother. My parents continued to visit my grandmother occasionally, but avoided seeing me. Whenever they came over, I would leave the house and only return once they had gone. Neither they nor I seemed to care about this arrangement. This went on for a couple of years until my grandmother had a major argument with them. She told them they were terrible parents for not trying to communicate with me, especially when I was doing better, and they had a reason to apologize for their past behavior. They refused to acknowledge their mistakes and continued to act as if they were perfect parents and I was just a bad kid. They called me a rotten apple and a freak once more, which infuriated my grandmother. She told them never to come back, and they stuck to it. Their egos prevented them from admitting they had failed me as parents, which is why I turned out the way I did at 14. For nearly 10 years, my grandmother and I had no contact with my parents, acting as if they didn't exist. During this time, I achieved many milestones, but my parents never reached out to me. Despite being active on social media and not blocking them, they chose not to contact me. Only now have they reached out, and it's because my grandmother passed away a couple of months ago. Losing my grandmother was incredibly difficult, as she was the only person who had truly supported me. Even though we hadn't lived together for the past few years, with me moving out for college and later getting my own place, she remained my rock and support system. Life without her has been challenging, and I was still grieving when my parents reached out. Less than half a year after her passing, they appeared at my door, demanding a share of my inheritance. They claimed they needed my help to fix a mess my supposedly perfect brother had made. They visited me a few days ago without my brother, which was unusual since he always accompanied them before. I decided to speak with them, initially thinking they were there to apologize. After some small talk and expressions of sympathy, they quickly got to the point. They revealed that my brother had developed a drug problem in college, which was now affecting his ability to work. They tried to downplay the severity, but it was clear he was in serious trouble and needed help. They asked me to share my inheritance to pay for a residential rehab program, which was apparently very expensive. I asked why he couldn't attend one of the more affordable programs, and they told me they had tried, but it wasn't sufficient for him. Despite not knowing the exact costs of rehab, I was aware that I was financially secure, thanks to a good job and my grandmother's careful investments. My parents, despite knowing they might need money, had been too proud to maintain a relationship with her or apologize towards the end. I told my parents that I was willing to help them with whatever amount they needed, but with one condition: they had to publicly acknowledge everything they had done in the past. This included the way they treated me, the hurtful things they said, and their treatment of my grandmother. They also needed to admit that they now required my assistance, and explain why they needed the money. My grandmother had always kept things private to avoid drama, but I felt it was necessary for everyone to know the truth, especially since my parents had the audacity to ask for help despite their past behavior. When I laid out my condition, their faces fell. They tried to negotiate, calling me unreasonable and selfish, but I stood firm. I told them this was my condition: take it or leave it. I had no issues providing the money they needed, as I no longer harbored any ill will towards my brother. But I wanted my parents to publicly acknowledge their wrongdoings. They definitely would have to acknowledge what they did in order for me to completely move on from what had happened, because they treated me terribly. They were also unkind to my grandmother, and this was about her money. If they wanted her money, they had to acknowledge their actions. It was as simple as that. When I told them this, they began calling me heartless and emotionless, claiming they never expected such behavior from me. I told them they shouldn't have expected anything from me at all, given that we hadn't spoken for the past decade. If they wanted my help, they would have to acknowledge and accept their mistakes and apologize. That was the end of it for me. After much crying and accusations, they left. They are now trying to change my mind, telling me that my brother is in a really bad condition and needs my help. But I don't understand why they expect me to do things for them when they never did anything for me. My grandmother and I only had each other. They never bothered to help or even check on us. Even when my grandmother passed away, they probably wouldn't have known unless I had informed my relatives about the funeral. So why should I help people who have had nothing to do with us for the past 10 years? I just want to make sure am I wrong for telling my parents that I won't help them financially if they don't accept and acknowledge their mistakes publicly. Update 1. Thank you for all the comments on my original post. I am doing fine. Thank you so much for asking. It has been really difficult for me to deal with the loss of my grandmother. But she was very old, and I'm glad that she's in a better place now. She lived her life to the fullest, and I know she passed away without any regrets. Thank you for the concern and the condolences. Anyway, regarding my parents, they are still trying to bother me online. But I've told them that if they don't do as I said, they can give up any hope of inheriting any money. I know that my grandmother left everything to me in her will, and I'm sure my parents know this as well since the lawyer had sent out an email. Now all they can do is wallow in their regret. I'm not going to go back on my word. It has been a week since I last spoke to them, and since none of their pleas have worked, they have resorted to sending me photos of my brother. He looks bad and is in a pathetic condition. They keep sending pictures telling me that he needs my help, and that I should step up and do something for him. To that I only have one thing to say: where were they when I needed that kind of help? They abandoned me, and I was just lucky that my grandmother had my back. Otherwise, I don't know where I would have ended up. They did not care about me. And as much as I feel bad for my brother, I can't help them if they don't apologize for what they did. It has to be public because I want everyone to know what kind of people they really are. If they can set aside their egos just this once, I guess I'll help them out. For me, it's about shattering their pride. Their pride caused everything. And now, If they truly want to help the child they claim to love, they have to set it aside. I want to see what comes first for them, my brother, or their pride. Update 2. It's been 10 days since I last spoke to my parents. I eventually stopped responding to their messages, but they showed up at my place again a few hours ago. This time with my brother in tow. It was a pitiful sight. At the door, I told them they couldn't continue this way. Their behavior was only hurting their chances of getting anything from me. I expressed how uncomfortable I was with their actions, even toward my brother, as it felt dehumanizing to use him like this. I told them to leave, and for a moment they refused. They demanded I promise to help them as soon as I could if I wanted them to go. I stood firm, saying I would make no such promises, and threatened to call the police if they continued to harass me. Considering my brother's condition, this threat scared them, and they left. However, my father couldn't resist a parting shot, calling both my grandmother and me the most selfish people on the planet. This accusation came from the same people who had dumped me on her doorstep because they couldn't deal with a special needs child. If my grandmother and I are selfish, then there aren't even words invented yet to describe them. Update 3. Hi, I forgot to update here because I got really busy with work. Nearly 2 months have passed since my last post and a lot has changed. I've blocked my parents from contacting me and moved into a better apartment in a new neighborhood, which they don't have the address for. I've also informed all my relatives not to give out my address to anyone, especially my parents. Last time, someone decided my parents deserve to know where I lived because my brother was suffering, which is how they found me. This time, I ensured that wouldn't happen again. After my dad called me selfish during our last conversation, I decided to block them because I didn't want any more drama. They have shown me that their pride will always come first, above everything else, including the son they claim to love. I can accept that they never loved me due to my dyslexia and ADHD, but my brother was always their golden child. It's beyond me how they couldn't make one small sacrifice for him. All they had to do was acknowledge their mistakes. It would have been easy, as most of our family was already aware of the bad blood between us. It wasn't like they would be revealing anything new. Yet they couldn't bring themselves to apologize because, in their minds, they had never done anything wrong and were perfect. Well, they can keep their delusions, and I will keep my inheritance. Fair enough. Update 4. 3 months have passed since I last shared an update, and life has continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The silence from my parents has been a welcome relief, allowing me to focus on my career and personal growth without the constant emotional turmoil they used to bring. Despite blocking them, I've occasionally heard through relatives about the ongoing struggles of my brother and the desperate attempts of my parents to secure help for him. During this period, I received an unexpected letter from an old family friend who had been close to my grandmother. She shared stories about my grandmother's younger years, her struggles, and her immense strength and resilience. Reading these stories gave me a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper connection to the woman who had been my rock. It reminded me of the values she instilled in me and the importance of staying true to myself. Inspired by my grandmother's legacy, I decided to use a portion of my inheritance to start a scholarship fund in her name. This fund would help young students with learning disabilities like dyslexia and ADHD to access quality education and support services. It felt like the perfect way to honor her memory and give back to the community. The scholarship was launched with much enthusiasm, and seeing the first few recipients' gratitude and excitement was incredibly fulfilling. One day while I was at a coffee shop working on some projects related to the scholarship fund, I unexpectedly ran into an old high school friend, Sarah. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we quickly fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about old times and catching up on our lives. It was refreshing to reconnect with someone from my past who remembered the struggles I went through and could appreciate how far I had come. Sarah shared her own journey, revealing that she had become a therapist, specializing in family counseling and addiction. Hearing about her work sparked an idea in my mind. What if I could help my brother without directly involving my parents? I discussed the idea with Sarah, who offered her professional insights and support. With Sarah's guidance, I reached out to a reputable rehab facility anonymously, paying for my brother's treatment up front without my parents' knowledge. I informed the facility that the support was conditional on my brother voluntarily committing to the program, and making genuine efforts towards recovery. I also arranged for a separate counselor to work with him on rebuilding his life post-rehabilitation. I knew my actions might seem contradictory to some, given my firm stance with my parents, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility towards my brother. After all, he was also a victim of our parents' failures. And despite everything, I wanted to give him a chance to turn his life around. A few weeks later, I received a thank you letter from the rehab facility, informing me that my brother had checked in and was showing promising signs of commitment to his recovery. They assured me of their continuous support and updates on his progress. While I felt a mix of emotions, including apprehension and hope, I was at peace knowing I had done something meaningful. As for my parents, I heard through the grapevine that they were bewildered by my brother's sudden opportunity for rehabilitation and were trying to figure out who had funded it. I chose to remain silent, letting them wonder. It was a small victory, knowing they couldn't claim credit or use this to bolster their egos. With my brother's journey towards recovery underway and the scholarship fund making a positive impact, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My grandmother's legacy lived on, not only through me, but also through the lives I was able to touch and change for the better. And that, I realized, was the best way to honor her memory and all she had done for me.